And had he not tempted me with a bobcat named Boris, I don't know that I ever would have went to meet him, because it was, through social media, and I normally don't respond to social media requests like that. But I went and met Boris at the Wildlife Discovery Center in Lake Forest, Illinois, and Steve helped me found or like develop this into a 501c3. He is an accountant by trade. So one of the first things I wanted to do as we became this 501c3 was really find a way to contribute to research. So almost all the previous research in Illinois was conducted in Southern Illinois, which is much different habitat than the rest of the state. So they basically did all their research down there, took that data and extrapolated it across the entire state, and said, this is how many bobcats we think we have. And I felt like that probably might have been a misrepresentation of bobcats. So I have learned that Dr. Chris Jakes, who is an assistant professor at Western Illinois University, was beginning to do some bobcat research, and he had no funding at the time. So we raised enough money in 2017 to supply him with 10 GPS collars. And those are a little bit more expensive than the VHF collars, but they allow you to sit at a computer and use the GPS signal to track the bobcat instead of going out in the field, which can sometimes take hours through the VHF technology. We also launched our website in 2017. In 2018, he said, hey, I want a bunch of the VHF collars this time. I just want to get more collars on cats. So we donated, I think it was 10 more collars. He had one graduate student, and they had about 200 cameras out at the time. And they had about, I don't know, I think they were getting close to having maybe 20 cats collared. So he really needed some help with some things. And one of the things we volunteered to help with was sorting through their camera trap photos. We also, in 2018, I don't know if any of you remember this, but Hoo Haven had a bobcat kitten that was brought to them from the Joe Davies area. And it was the first time they've ever had a bobcat kitten in rehabilitation. They didn't have the facilities for it, so we helped fund a enclosure. In the last several years, we've been focusing on education and advocacy. Dr. Jakes has received, I believe, almost a $300,000 grant recently, so he doesn't really need us to raise money for him like he did before. We will spend a lot of time this year on advocacy, and I'll get to that in a little bit. We hope to have a new bill introduced that will make some changes to what's going on with bobcats in our state. So just a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to go over just the basics about bobcats, the biology, their habitats, things like that. And I will go through the history and legislation. I'll share with you some of the Western Illinois research that we were involved in when we were helping fund their project, and then what's next for the Bobcat Foundation. I first like to start with a couple of bobcat stories, because it's always good to have a bobcat story in the back of your pocket. And this is a Native American myth. How did the bobcat get its spots? It's actually a Shawnee tale. So it basically is the story about a bobcat that was chasing a rabbit, and he had almost caught the rabbit when the rabbit jumped into a hollow of the tree. The rabbit called out to Bobcat, "I'll stay in here forever. You'll never eat me." And the bobcat responded, "Well, you'll have to come out. You're going to get hungry." And the rabbit knew that Bobcat was right, so he called out again and said, "Why don't you make a big fire so you can roast me as soon as I run out?" And the bobcat thought this was a great idea. So as soon as the fire was hot enough, the rabbit jumped out of the tree and right into the center of the fire, scattering the hot coals all over Bobcat's coat. And even though Bobcat jumped into the river and didn't catch fire, his fur was singed dark brown everywhere in every place that a coal had landed. And those are the spots that you see in a bobcat coat today. So kind of a cool little Native American tale. And to kind of dovetail into that Native American tale, this is a great story that is actually in Illinois. It's the Illinois Hopewell Mounds, which are down along the Illinois River. So when IDOT was getting ready to excavate and build a highway through this area, they dug up all these dirt domes, and they categorized and filed all of their findings into the Illinois State Museum. And a research student several years ago went down to go through some of the categories. She was actually doing canine research, and she was pulling a lot of things out from the archives that she thought were canine related. And she happened to pull this little box out that had the remains of what had originally been labeled a canine. And upon closer inspection, she discovered that it was in fact a bobcat kitten. It's the only bobcat buried with a collar made of bones, and it's like bones and bare teeth and shell beads, but it's the only wildcat decorated burial on record. So nowhere else in the world can this be found, but it can be found right here in Illinois. I used to tell people that you could go down to the Illinois State Museum and see this on display, because I actually thought it was on display. And a couple years ago, my daughters and I took a road trip through Illinois Route 66 all the way out to the Grand Canyon. I'm like, we're going to stop here because I want to see this in person. And we stopped there, and we were just walking around the museum looking for this, and I couldn't find it. So I finally asked some folks that were working on building a new exhibit where I could find this. And they were great. They're like, well, that's not on display, but we can put you in touch with the people over in archives, and you can go over there and see it. So I thought that was great that they did that. Unfortunately, it's not on displays, but if you do go down there and you see people working on exhibits, feel free to ask them, because they might send you over and you'll be able to see it. So getting into the biology, I'll start with the taxonomy. They're a member of the lynx family. So that consists of 4 cats: the Eurasian lynx, the Canadian lynx, Siberian lynx, and of course the bobcat. And there's actually 13 subspecies of bobcats. So when you see, or you might see a bobcat from Florida versus a bobcat from Montana, and you wonder why they look so different. Well, a lot of it is because they are a member of a different subspecies. I also like to go through and point out the difference between a lynx and a bobcat. These are actually often confused by seasoned researchers when they're out in the wilds and at a distance. They can look familiar or similar, but there are some distinct markers on these 2 cats that are quite different. And you can just see with the lynx on the left how much larger and longer its back legs are, and how big those paws are. And those paws are big because lynx are mostly in the northern part of North America, so more so in Canada. Some of our northern states do have lynx that will move down into them, but it's very rare. I think it's been since the 70s since they've even seen a lynx in the state of Wisconsin. So it's been quite a while, but they use those paws to, like snowshoes, to move across the snow. Another distinct marker is those longer ear tufts, and they are a little bit lighter than a bobcat. They get their general description from their bobtail, of course. They can range in size between 10 and 40 pounds, and I would say the average bobcat that was part of the Dr. Jake's research has been around 20 to 25 pounds. They're not very big. When the day that I went out with the researchers, the cat that they had trapped and collared, she was only 14 pounds. So some people think they're bigger than what they are, but they're actually quite small. They're about 3 feet in length and 2 feet high. That's actually the length. 3 feet is, when you think about the difference in size between a cougar and a bobcat is about the size and length as a cougar's tail. So cougars are quite large. And then you can see the difference between the most confused in identification, mostly by the general public, between these 3 cats. So oftentimes a bobcat is misidentified as a domestic cat or a cougar. And oftentimes people think they see a cougar and it's really a bobcat. And this has happened quite a bit locally, even in Belvedere. Maybe it was about a year ago. There was a social media post, cougar seen in Boone County out on like Spring Creek, and I forgot what the crossroad was, maybe Squaw Prairie. And they had taken a picture of it, and it was, the DNR actually went out and, used life-size, or used a cone to kind of compare in size of this cat, and it was a domestic cat. So misidentification is a huge issue. So it happens with the seasoned researchers, it happens with hunters. And one of the things that you can do, if you think you have seen that and you actually have a photo and you want to kind of size up what's going on in your photo, you can use a life-size cutout. So like for this hunter that misidentified a bobcat as a cougar in northern Minnesota, he had a photograph of it, and their DNR went out to put a life-size cutout of this cougar in a tree and then compared it to the photo of what this hunter had taken. It was pretty obvious that it was not a cougar and was more likely a bobcat. If you're on social media, Dr. Michelle LaRue, who runs the Cougar Network on Twitter, does a great quiz every Friday called Cougar or Not. I love this quiz. I would say probably 90% of the time it ends up being a bobcat, which is why I love it, but it's fun to look through the photos, and it's quite amazing how many times she presents a photo and people get it wrong. Bobcats are considered crepuscular, which means they're active at twilight and often until midnight. It's actually breeding season for bobcats right now, so you might also see them more active during the day this time of year. And also with the scarcity of food in the wintertime, sometimes they can be more active during the day, but they're pretty secretive animals. And if you get to see one, consider yourself very lucky. They're mostly solitary, although back in November, we had a presentation that we posted with a photographer she lives in New Mexico and has a ranch where a bobcat family lives under the deck. And it is several females that have lived there together. So it kind of goes against the solitary research that's out there. I know she's been working with researchers to look more at what she's seen at this particular location. So this whole thing that males' territories overlap and females do not share territory kind of doesn't line up with what she's seen. So it's kind of interesting. Research on bobcats there's not a lot of it, and it's mostly because they're such secretive animals. Their home range is an average of 8 square miles. With the research that has been conducted at Western Illinois, that's shown that the home range for bobcats is much different than this average of 8 square miles, and that has to do a lot with fragmented habitat. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And they're an opportunistic predator. So they're wait and ambush. They don't like to expend a lot of energy to get their meal. I love this photo. It's actually from Louisiana, and that's a whooping crane colt in the background. So it's a who is stalking who. And interestingly enough, bobcats are the most dangerous predator to whooping cranes. So if you think about the impact of whooping cranes, bobcats do have a slight impact on their recovery. This was sent to me from a guy in Carroll County. So when you think about bobcat behavior and them being kind of sneaky and creeping along and stalking, here is a video that he had from one of his trail cams. And I'm sure this bobcat must have seen some prey off on the other side of that log there. As soon as I can get this to start. I think one of my favorite pastimes is looking at trail cam videos and photos. It's always fun to see what wildlife is up to, and it's kind of a non-invasive way to also observe wildlife. The bobcat diet consists mostly of small rodents, rabbits, and squirrels, and some birds. And these are, interesting enough, are not game birds. Again, this is research from Southern Illinois. It does not vary though. If you look at research across any bobcat study, the main diet tends to be rodents, rabbits, and squirrels. And, I'm not going to lie and say that they don't impact the deer population. I shouldn't say that they won't hunt deer, because they will hunt deer, but they don't have an impact on the deer population. I know that that is one of the myths of why we need to control bobcats in the state of Illinois, but they really don't have any impact on the deer population at all. The benefits of predators in a balanced ecosystem is tremendous. Because when there's an overabundance of prey species, it overtaxes food resources. There's two examples I like to share. One is this one from Cumberland Island, Georgia, and the other one is Kiowa Island in the Carolinas. But in Cumberland, Georgia, they introduced bobcats as part of an ecosystem restoration project in 1989. And they did use them to help control the deer population. But what happens is once bobcats help kind of balance out that ecosystem, and typically they want to dine on the fawns because that's an easy prey, right? They don't want to overextend themselves. They want an easy target. Bobcats' average size is 25 pounds. For them to take down a deer, it takes a lot of energy for them. So typically their diet is fawn. So once they help kind of control that deer population, what they saw down there was their native oak increased, the weight of the deer increased, and the deer became healthier as well. So there's this huge benefit to that. In Kiowa Island, and I don't know if anyone has been following what's going on in there over there right now, but they also did the same thing, introduced bobcats on this, and this is a residential island, people live there, to help control their deer population, because there's not any hunting of deer on that, in that particular area. So they brought in bobcats to help, and the bobcats did. The ecosystem became balanced, but people have been using rodenticides, and it's significantly wiped out their bobcats. So rodenticides are terrible not only for bobcats, but for raptors and birds of prey that also eat rodents. These species of animals are great rodent control. You really don't need to put rodenticides out if you have a balanced ecosystem. So I would always warn against using those. And the other benefit is they're not a threat to humans. So they're great to have in the ecosystem. There's, in the state of Illinois, there's like 0 cases of bobcats attacking anyone. There's one case, but when I say 0, there's one. But what happened is, and I know this because we had invited this guy to come, he's U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we had invited him to come to one of our Sinnissippi Audubon presentations, and he had to call me the day of his presentation and tell me that he couldn't come because one of his staff was bit by a bobcat. And I said, what? And so apparently this is when, before the hunting season was open, and a farmer it was a incidental trap, had a bobcat in a trap. He had set the trap out, I think, for a coyote or something, and had this bobcat, called U.S. Fish and Wildlife to come help them remove the bobcat. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife officer was holding the bobcat up, showing the bobcat off instead of immediately releasing it, and the guy got bit. So probably not the bobcat's fault. That was a totally human error. So it wasn't a case of a bobcat attacking a person. It was self-defense. Their reproduction and life cycle, an average lifespan in the wild, 7 to 10 years. Like I said, breeding season is right now through June. The peak is in February and March. I don't have a audio clip of what bobcats sound like, but during breeding season, I've not heard them personally, but I've heard that they sound just like a woman screaming. So it's an awful sound. When you hear a bobcat, it's not like a cat meow or anything like that. It is a very unusual noise sound that they make, and I need to remember to add a clip of that to my slides. Their gestation is approximately 60 days. They have 2-3 kittens per litter, and kittens will remain with their mother for 9 to 12 months. This photo is from a gentleman in Carroll County too. So Carroll County actually has a decent size bobcat population where people see them a little bit more often. But this gentleman always knew that he had bobcat on his property, but he had never been able to photograph a bobcat before, never had an opportunity to photograph or see it. And then this summer, I don't know, this was a couple years ago, the mother came through walking with her 3 kittens. It's such a cute little photo. I always like to share this information too, the difference between a bobcat kitten and a domestic kitten. There was a case this about a year ago where a FedEx driver along Interstate 70 saw what he thought was a kitten, pulled over, picked it up, took it to the nearest veterinarian location that he could find, and it turned out it was a bobcat kitten. So there's distinct markers too between a domestic cat and a bobcat. As you can see here, they do have those black ears with the white tips. Domestic cats don't have these markings. It's only bobcats that do. They have the bobtail, of course, and they have a much rounder head and eyes than a domestic kitten. And also those white kind of eyeliner marks around their eyes. So if you're wondering how you can tell if you have bobcat on your property without having a camera trap, or without visually seeing them, you can always look for tracks and scat. There's 2 ways to tell the difference between a canine and a feline. So you'll never see the claws on feline tracks. Cats keep those claws retracted because they protect them because they're used for hunting. And of course, canines don't retract their claws, so you're going to see those markings in the dirt or the mud or the snow. Cats also have a rounder shape and that M-shaped pad, so kind of like 3 pads on the bottom. And canines it's more like an upside down V with the 2 pads on the bottom. Bobcat tracks are a little bit smaller than 2 inches in length and width, but 2 inches is about average. So size for a marker. If you find a track, it's always good to put something down to size it up when you take a photo of it. So you can kind of compare where it's at. I mean, if you come across a cougar track, I would feel very comfortable coming across bobcat tracks and not be hesitant to stay in the area, but I would not ever feel comfortable coming across a cougar track. I would not want to be in the area at all. So it's always good to kind of measure and size up those tracks to see what you have. And then for scat, bobcat scat is heavily segmented. You're going to see little bits of fur in bones in that scat. So that's one way to tell the scat as well. Habitat, bobcats are found in all of North America. So they're all over. They're in woodlands, mountains, deserts, and urban landscapes, and even on the top of cactus. On the center photo is actually from one of our board members who has a home in Tucson, and she has bobcats that come quite a bit on her porch. And the one on the right there is typical habitat in Illinois. They like to kind of stay on the edge of woodland areas. They're not in open areas. They do like to keep themselves hidden. And this is a habitat suitability map. I like to share this. So the areas in red where there's been the most significant bobcat sightings down there in the Shawnee area, then up along the Illinois River, and then in Joe Davies, right? That is the areas in Illinois that really has the most suitable habitat. So those are the areas typically where the bobcats are. And bobcats, of course, as they disperse through the state from the southern area, they're going to move up along waterways. So you'll see them moving up along the Illinois River. I gave a presentation recently for some folks in Wisconsin, and I had learned that Iowa found comparable DNA in their bobcats to the bobcats in southern Wisconsin. So I thought that was interesting because bobcats in southern Wisconsin are not dispersing from their northern area. They're dispersing from Iowa into southern Wisconsin. And I thought that was interesting. And that could be the case there, of course, up in the Joe Davies area, but those have some genetic relations to Iowa bobcats, but it's unknown. We're not collecting, no one is collecting that information from any of the bobcat studies in Illinois. A little bit about Illinois history and legislation. So they were nearly eradicated from Illinois by the mid-1900s. They were protected as a threatened species from 1977 to 1999. Current estimated population of bobcats is approximately 5,000. And like I mentioned in my introduction, that bill to allow hunting was first introduced in 2014. And there was a lot of objections by a lot of people. Unfortunately, that bill still slid through. A lot of the objections were due to studies on accurate bobcat populations had not been completed for quite some time, and they were all completed in the southern Illinois region. So Western began a study in 2015, and that's a little bit, right? So they had already agreed that they're going to open a season, but they didn't even begin a new study until after they came to that agreement. And it's kind of opposite of what you should be doing. You should be doing your research first and then making the decision whether or not you have a hunting season. So there's a whole nother reason why there's a lot of people that just felt this is bad science. Former Governor Quinn did veto that bill on January 11th before he left office. And he stated that bobcats are a valuable part of Illinois' ecosystem. We should protect it. We all have a responsibility to protect and maintain Illinois' wildlife. Allowing people to hunt bobcats in Illinois violates that responsibility. And this is just how political this hunting bobcats is. Within, it was less than a week of Ronner being in office, he had this bill back on the floor, and it was signed into legislation before anyone could do anything about it. And the law became effective January 1st of 2016. The first season in over 40 years opened that fall of 2016. There was 6,416 applicants for 500 permits. So more people applied for a permit than bobcats in the state of Illinois. And to me, that's just concerning that many people are interested in hunting this species. The permit's only $5, which isn't much. We are in our 5th season. The bobcat season isn't quite over yet. It ends next week. This year there was 1,000 permits. There's still $5, and it did expand the geographical areas. We had worked alongside both Illinois Environmental Council and the Humane Society over the years to have some changes made. So after the first season, there were changes in the legislation that closed areas of hunting. Winnebago County was one of those counties that was closed, and it was closed until the bill sunset in 2019. Well, the bill sunset and the DNR moved pretty quickly to open up other areas before, again, any kind of bill could be introduced. Unfortunately, to make changes in the hunting legislation, it has to be done, or the hunting rules and regulations, it has to be done through legislation, which seems kind of, it's a convoluted way to manage wildlife, if you ask me. And so we were unable to do anything why that bill after that bill sunset. So now I have heard that there will be a bill on the floor in the next couple of weeks. And I've been watching the Illinois General Assembly site. Of course, I'm sure Jennifer Walling, who's with the Illinois Environmental Council, will let me know the bill number as soon as it's open, but I get impatient sometimes, and I'm logging into the General Assembly website twice a day, checking to see if there's any new bobcat bills. The first season results, this is what it looked like. There was 141 bobcats that were killed that first season, 69 through hunting, 49 trapping, 12 through archery, and 11 salvaged. And salvage just means that was a roadkill. So if you find a roadkill bobcat, you cannot just pick it up and take it to the taxidermy shop to get the fur. You have to have a permit to do that. The top counties, Pike, Jackson, Jefferson, Carroll, and Randolph, all but Carroll County are in that southern kind of south central area of the state. And you can see where that bobcat hunting zone was the first season. And those boundaries changed once the new legislation was introduced by Illinois Environmental Council, and it kind of closed down quite a few areas where, in fact, almost every area in white was closed down because, why hunt in those areas if there's no bobcats? This is what the overall season results look like. I know we don't have enough data points here. I don't know the 2020 results yet. I did try and get some preliminary data, and I was unable to get anything. In order to, actually trend, and I do have a trend line on here, you should have more than 6 data points, and I don't yet. So it's not statistically relevant for me to say that there's any trends going on, but if you take out that first season and you kind of see what's going on with the numbers right now, you can see that since 2017, the numbers have started to decline a little bit. It's not significant, but it's a little bit of a decline. And I'm looking forward to seeing the results of 2020 because I would think that it's probably the same. You can see the methods of take, again, is through archery, hunting, trapping, and salvage. So in 2017, I was surprised to see the number of salvages go up so high. I don't have any explanation for that, but it's hard for me to fathom that there was that many bobcats killed on the road, but perhaps there was. And then you can see it's that even that number is starting to decline. So as soon as the 2020 results are out, I will of course update this graph and continue to monitor this. One of the things that is not transparent with the IDNR is this information. It's hard to find it. If you look at some of the other DNR websites, Wisconsin's a good example. You can go there and find just about any information you want on bobcats, what data they're collecting. In Wisconsin, they're collecting the sex, which I think is very relevant. Illinois, they're not collecting the sex of the bobcats that are killed. And I think you do have to monitor that and take that into consideration when you're looking at how bobcats, the population is going to remain stable while you're hunting it, because they're such a tricky species to capture accurate numbers are. And I just wanted to also point out that the core tenets of the North American model of wildlife conservation actually include 4 fundamental hallmarks of science relevant to natural resource management. And I don't think our own IDNR does a good job at that. Those 4 tenets include measurable objectives. So what is the objective of hunting bobcats in Illinois? I don't know, I sat at the table with them last December, not 2020, but 2019. And it was myself, John Rogner, Colleen Callahan, and a bunch of biologists, and Mark Ayers from the Humane Society, and Elliot Clay, who's the legislative liaison for the Illinois Environmental Council. And I heard the public relations persons from IDNR say that hunters have earned the right to hunt bobcats. Now, to me, that is not an objective for hunting bobcats. I realize hunters have contributed significantly to conservation efforts in Illinois, but I don't think that gives them a right to hunt bobcats. The other thing that you need to have is evidence. And bobcats basically recover. It took them 40 years to recover in Illinois. So is there enough evidence to show that we should be hunting them? I don't think there is. And transparency, the IDNR is not transparent in this information at all. Every year, I file an additional FOIA request to get additional information. How many people applied for permits? How many permits were from what area of the state? So you can get that information, but it's not readily available. You have to ask for it. And then the last core tenet is an independent review. And what I learned when I was meeting with the IDNR December of 2019, and I asked them, I'm like, so how do you make the decision? So your bobcat season ends. How do you make the decisions for the next season? What's gonna remain in place? Are you gonna have to reduce the number of permits? Who's reviewing that information? Is there a committee? Can I attend this meeting? Because, right, it should be transparent. It should be an independent review. And it's one person in a cubicle making these decisions. It doesn't go to committee. The IDNR is not reviewing this at any committee level. It's one person saying, yep, I think we can continue to hunt bobcats. There's no issues. And they move on with the season. I think there's a lot of issues with that. But that's my take on the legislation and what's going on with the IDNR. I do want to share with you before our time ends here some information about the Western Illinois research. So their purpose was to look at abundance, survival, and develop a camera study protocol or camera survey protocol, which I think has been expanding. And I thought I saw a graduate position through University of Illinois that would actually do some additional camera studies of predators and mammals in Illinois. So I think his protocol is expanding to other areas. Their camera study actually began in July of 2015. I mentioned it's Dr. Chris Jakes that is the assistant professor that is leading this research. I'm sure he has new graduate students by now because Ed actually graduated 2 years ago, and that's who I worked with. And then Tim Swearinger was his predecessor graduate student. So that's actually Ed there on the left. Ed was a great guy to work with, very interesting guy, was a researcher with U.S. Fish and Wildlife on the Mexican gray wolf project. So he was great when we went out with him and we were working with landowners. I shouldn't say we, when they were working with landowners, he just had a great rapport and knew exactly how to talk about predators with them. And it was just great to learn from him and watch him as he discussed predators on their land. But their study objectives were to estimate density of bobcat population throughout West Central Illinois, estimate bobcat home range and relationships with detection by camera traps. And the method that Dr. Jakes used, although I've heard that he's changed his methodology a little bit, I learned that when we were down at the meeting with the IDNR, but he used a spatial capture recapture model, never been used in Midwestern landscapes. It's never been documented in the literature before. So this was a new methodology that he was using. For their live trapping, they used cage traps. They really are dependent on landowners and trappers for their bobcat study. They don't have just one graduate student. They just don't have the time to set their own traps and go out there and try and monitor the traps as well. So they really rely on hunters and landowners. There's cage traps. They also use soft foothold traps, which they say are not supposed to impact the cats. I might disagree with that, but they still use them. And then they bait the traps with carcasses and visual olfactory attractants. So these are cats, so they're very attracted to shiny things, sparkly things, just like domestic cats, and smells. So I know that the trap that they used the day that I got to go down and watch them collar, it had a game bird wing attached, kind of dangling in front of it, which lured the bobcat in. So their research area includes Fulton, Hancock, McDonald, and Schuyler counties. That was the first 4-county area that they had. About a year and a half ago, maybe 18 months ago, they expanded into Bureau, Marshall, Peoria, Putnam, Tazewell, and Woodford. So they definitely have expanded their area for research. During the season that I was involved with them, they had 220 cameras out. They 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 60-day intervals to photo capture and recapture bobcats. This is one of the camera traps I helped set up. They're about 14 inches off the ground. And when I talk about visual attractants, you can see that CD that's kind of dangling there from the trees, and it's actually dangling between the camera trap area. And the camera trap has 2 cameras set up in it. And the reason for that is the 2 bottom arrows are the 2 camera traps, is because they want the bobcat to pass through those 2 cameras. They can get a capture or photograph of each of their inner legs as they cross through and get a good capture of the bobcat. And one of the things that is distinguishable on bobcats, if it's not a collared bobcat and it's not a ear-tagged bobcat, the leg bars on bobcats are individual to each cat. It's like a fingerprint to humans. So if they get a nice capture, nice photograph of those leg bars, they are able to determine from other pictures if it's the same cat that's coming through based on those markings. And that top arrow is where that CD is hanging and dangling. And they suspect, from way across that creek there, that a bobcat could see this CD and come over and then kind of investigate and walk right through that area. So from December 2015 through May 28th, they had over 1 million images from those 220 cameras. Of those 1 million images, about 1,800 were actually bobcats. So even though they set up the traps for the cat to pass through, right? Cats are curious. They don't always do what you want them to do. And here's one coming up to investigate the camera. It's not always cats you see on the camera either. There's other wildlife that do show up, and even cows. And this was the first camera trap that I went through. There was 1,400 images. Of those 1,400 images, there was only one bobcat image. And I really expected to see way more bobcats in those photographs that I was going through, and I didn't. It was kind of disappointing, but it was also fun to look at what wildlife was showing up on the camera traps, and everything from cardinals to owls to mice that you could see moving along, and it would trigger the camera so you could kind of see what the mouse was doing. So it was still fun to go through and look at. They do use 2 types of collars. Those GPS collars, like I mentioned, those are the best for the researchers to use because it doesn't take field time to track the cats. It counts 2 points per day every 13 hours. They can get a good idea of where the cats are moving. The VHF collars you have to use. That's actually my cousin in the photo. There is one of the days we were out with Ed, and he's using triangulation there to kind of ping where the bobcats are. If the bobcat is underweight, so under 15 pounds, typically they do get a VHF collar because the GPS collars have a pretty big battery pack on them and they're a little bit heavier. So if it's a small cat, they will use the lighter collars on them. And they have had recaptures. So when you think about a cat that's been trapped and collared and gone through all of that, you would think that they would not want to get in a trap again and they'd avoid it. They actually don't. They have had recaptures. Their mortalities include roadkill 2 weeks after trapping. So researchers that do this type of collaring and trapping, if they're using those foothold traps or any kind of trap, the cat that I went down when they were collaring, she was actually pacing she was in a cage trap and she was pacing in it and was rubbed her face on that cage every time she would pace back and forth, and had rubbed kind of underneath her eyes raw. She's fine. She's still out there. They're still monitoring her, but that is an injury obtained while trapping. And so if within 2 weeks that would have caused her death, that would have been associated with the research. And they did have one cat that was in a foothold trap that did have some minor abrasions on that paw. I don't know if they could confirm that's what was the cause of death, whether it had got infection or what, because I don't know if they did any type of mortality review, but it did die 2 weeks after trapping, so they had to count that as their mortality. Indiscriminate trapping is awful. This is why I don't like trapping. I'm not an anti-hunter, but trapping to me is something that I would not mind seeing go away. So if you put a trap out for a raccoon, like in this case, it was a conibear trap that was set up for a raccoon. The bobcat came up and was curious and stuck its head in the conibear trap and it killed it. And incidental trapping just doesn't affect mammals either. Eagles have been found in traps as well, other birds of prey. So I'm not a fan of trapping. One was shot. I do have that story of that bobcat next. It was a legal take. The hunter did have a permit. One was hit by a train, and that is always kind of surprising to me because it's like if you're on train tracks and you could hear a train coming, I don't know why they wouldn't move, but apparently this cat didn't. And they could confirm one was poached, and they could confirm that by they were able to find the collar in the bottom of a creek bed. So whoever killed that bobcat took the bobcat and then threw the collar, thinking nobody would be able to find it, but the collar was able to still be pinged. So M13, so Dr. Jakes doesn't believe in naming his bobcats. So M13 stands for male, and it was the 13th male that he had collared. This cat was actually collared in Fulton County. So that's where they initially put the monitoring device on, and the hunter took him in Macoupin County. So they, Dr. Jakes was actually happy to receive the call on this cat because he had been missing for 250 days. They suspect this was a male that had dispersed from Macoupin County, came up and investigated in Fulton County, trying to find its own territory, was young at the time, and for whatever reason didn't stick around and went back to where it came from. So it was 111 miles from the collared site, which is quite a long trek. This is what those two top photos are the day that I went out. We actually walked from that spot to the tree line area to put out the camera trap that I had shown you. It happened to be, I think it might have been a January or February day. It was in winter, but the ground was soft enough that you literally sank in it. My legs were so sore the next day because every time you would sink in the mud, you'd have to pull it out of the mud to walk. It was, I wasn't prepared for how much exercise I got that day. It's very tiring. And the bottom photo is what the truck setup looks like when they're out to collar the cat. This is what happens, typical things that you'll see when they're collaring and putting the monitoring devices on them. The first thing they always do after the cat has been sedated is to weigh it. And the reason they do that is because they want to make sure the cat is not going to wake up while they're working on it. So it's important to capture that weight to make sure that they've sedated it with the right amount of anesthetic. They also will use a flea comb. There's a tape measure. There's the tagging device for the ear tag. They are required through research protocols to monitor those vitals. So every 5 minutes, they're taking a heart rate, a temperature, breaths per minute. So if the temperature is dropping, they're putting heat pads on them. If the temperature is going up too high, they're putting ice packs on that cat to keep it stable. They collect the length, height, socket to shoulder. They're assessing full body condition. So if there's any kind of abrasions or sores or cuts, they will treat those at the time that they're doing all this and administer antibiotics if necessary. There's just another photo. They're also collecting blood, so they're looking for antibiotic presence. They're looking for rabies, distemper, parvo. They do collect DNA and genetics. All this blood from Western is just sitting in the research lab right now because they don't have the researchers, although maybe he does by now. At the time that I was involved, it was just sitting there because he didn't have enough researchers or grad students to be working on some of these things, but it's there for when they're ready to go and look at it. As I mentioned, they'll treat with antibiotics, iodine, saline, alcohol, wound compressions. If there is, if they're doing any kind of wound compressions, they will take bandages off before the cat is released. But they do a pretty good job of making sure that nothing happens and that the cat leaves maybe even sometimes better prepared for the wild than when they came in, because if they've had to treat an injury or something, the cat has received antibiotics for it. And this is what the collars look like. That's actually a GPS collar, so you can see how big those battery packs are. This is a good picture. It just shows how beautiful those undercoats are and what the fur industry loves about this particular species. It's just a beautiful coat. They also make sure the collar is attached appropriately, so they don't want it too snug, especially if it's a young cat that might grow more and they don't want it to fit too tight. So it's at least 2 fingers can fit between the collar and the cat itself. And then for the recovery process, it's 1 hour. So I know we're there quite longer with the female cats that I went out and watched them collar on. And she was just having trouble stabilizing. So she really did. She went from hot to cold. So she was ice packs, hot packs, ice packs again. They were just having trouble keeping her stable. And she did take a little bit longer to come out of sedation than normal, but they do make sure that, you know, they want these cats to be safe. So they stayed with her until she was ready to be released. And once she was released, she was fine out on her own. But one of the reasons they do want to make sure they're fully awake when they leave is because they don't want them darting out into the road or anything like that. And their findings concluded, and this is what's interesting, and this is, you know, we brought this up with the DNR in their decisions to keep some of the areas still open. Their density estimate, which basically means this is the number of bobcats per square kilometers, is very low compared to other studies. So his research has found that there's 1.43 bobcats per 100 square kilometers. It's the lowest recorded density on record for this species. So other research shows 3 to 8 bobcats per 100 square kilometers in Missouri, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The Southern Illinois research shows 30 bobcats per 100 square kilometers. Other ranges of studies summarized by Thornton and Peakins, 16.2, 1.43. This is West Central Illinois, which is kind of the habitat that we see across most of Illinois. It really begs the question of, is our population density high enough to be hunting them? The other thing that he found was instead of 8 square miles, these bobcats in this heavily fragmented area require 115 square miles for a home range. In his population study for his bobcats that he was monitoring, their survival rate is 51%. So you look at a low survival rate, a low density rate, and you really have to question whether or not we're hunting in the West Central area, which the season is open to hunt there. So what's next? We'll continue to provide education like this through whatever venue we can right now during this pandemic. We'll support rehabilitation where we can, and advocacy. I cannot wait to hear more about this new bill. So as soon as I hear more, I will definitely be sharing this information via our Facebook page. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the legislative process, but once that bill gets introduced and it goes through committee, you can submit a witness slip to either oppose or support the bill. So that really helps in decision making. You can certainly call your legislators. Legislators do want to hear from you. So I always try and advise people, don't create a moveon.org petition, because those mean nothing to legislators. Anyone can sign those. They want to hear from their constituents in their district. So if you have an issue with a bill that is being voted on in the legislation right now, you need to pick up the phone and call your legislators to tell them how you feel about it and give your opinion. And that's what they're there for. They're there to hear what we think about these bills, and they should be voting based on their constituent input. I always present my citations for this, so if anyone's interested in those. And then additionally, I always love to end on this quote in the book, Bobcat Master of Survival, which is one of my citations. I've actually talked with Kevin Hansen several times, but I love how he interprets what's going on with bobcats. And this in particular is one of my favorite quotes by him. But whatever the future holds for Lynx rufus, it's too important to be left in the hands of businessmen, politicians, or wildlife managers. An informed, caring, and engaged public is critical to the conservation of bobcats and all of wildlife. So with that, I would open it to comments and questions if there are any. I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen too so I can see the chat.
Okay. Can you see the chats, Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm going to scroll up and see if I missed some questions. So the first one, do bobcats pose a threat to humans? Absolutely not. like I said, I would feel very comfortable running into a bobcat in the wild. And for all I know, maybe one has, well, I know that we were within 50 yards of one when we were out pinging one. So I know that they can usually see you before you see them. And oftentimes they may only see you and you may not see them. So I would not be afraid of a bobcat at all. What type of advocacy do you recommend? So once, like I mentioned, once we know that there is a bill on the floor, whether it's in the Senate or the House, to contact your legislator and tell them how you feel about the bill, whether you oppose it or you support it. And all that information, like I said, I'll share it. And I usually put out a tip sheet too on how to sign those witness slips, because sometimes it's difficult to find your way around the Illinois General Assembly website, but there are witness slips that you can sign in support or opposition of the bill too. Can coyotes and bobcats overlap in their range? Absolutely, and they do. And one of the things I didn't talk about is, a bobcat is a predator, but they also have their own predators. Bobcat kittens, they're raised by the mother only. The males are usually not involved in raising those kittens. So whereas a coyote has this family group to protect the pups, it's just the mother with those kittens. And owls, birds of prey will take those bobcat kittens, as well as coyotes. In fact, the photographer that I mentioned that we had host a Zoom with us, she had a very eerie video. It showed, the bobcat family out, and they kind of disappeared into the woods. And then you can just hear the female bobcat just crying, and the coyotes had come in and taken one of her kittens. So it's not uncommon for coyotes to prey on bobcat kittens.
Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to put your video on so we can see you, if that's okay.
Yep. So beyond hunting, what do we know about bobcat mortality? What are other threats to bobcats? Well, there's a lot of other threats. I think the highest mortality of bobcats in almost any area is vehicle strikes. Bobcats usually can't sustain a vehicle strike because they are so small. Certainly disease plays a factor, and some of those other mortalities that I had mentioned. So this is an interesting question. What is the current monetary value of a bobcat pelt? It used to be much higher than what it is right now. So there's actually, I don't know what the current rates are, but I know at one time, both the otter and the bobcat were the highest pelts on the market. That is not the case anymore. Just fur in general, the pelts aren't worth much anymore. I think there's kind of been a movement kind of against the fur industry and people buying fur. So I don't think it's as popular as what it used to be. Should you report a sighting? It's totally up to you. I don't know if the IDNR is still collecting that data. There is a place, however, to report black bear, wolf, and cougar sightings. I actually have that link on our webpage in our resource area. So if you see any of those other large predators, certainly report those. I don't know that they're actually looking to track the number of bobcats right now. Do most other states allow hunting, and are the number of licenses usually based on the estimated number in the state? So the only states right now that do not allow hunting are Indiana, Ohio, New Hampshire, and one of those other states up in that northeastern region. And California recently proposed a no hunting, trapping ban on bobcats. So California also does not allow it. They also don't allow the sale of bobcat pelts. The licenses vary from state to state. I believe in the state of Texas, You can hunt bobcat anytime and you can take as many as you want. So it does vary state to state. Have bobcats been spotted in Winnebago, Stevenson, and Ogle counties? Yes. In Winnebago County, I've heard actually of several sightings fairly recently. Could it be the same bobcat? Yes. I don't think we have a huge breeding population of bobcats in Winnebago County, but I definitely think they're here, as well as Stevenson and Ogle. That was the last question. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. What is your website? I will type it in here, but it's Illinois, I think it's illinoisbobcat.org. Yeah, regarding Stevenson County, somebody mentioned that they have a recorded bobcat on their trail cam in the southwest portion of the county several times. It's probably the same bobcat. And if you get a good bobcat, I always tell people if they do have their trail cams and they're getting a nice picture of those leg bars, they compare those pictures and they know if it's multiple bobcats or the same bobcat.
Any other questions? Oh, there we go.
I got where do bobcats sleep? So bobcats do not make their own dens. They're opportunistic in finding their homes as well. So they'll use logs, barns, under decks, under sheds, in barns. And so they sleep where they can find a safe place to them to sleep. Female bobcats, often if they have a kitten, they've established a den, they move them quite frequently. Do bobcats reproduce like domestic cats? Why would they seem so slow to multiply? They don't reproduce like domestic cats. Although I have somebody that follows my Facebook page who I know is a trapper and has argued this point with me before, and he thinks that they do breed like domestic cats. I would argue that they don't. They have a very specific breeding season. I think that there has been documented cases where a female might have more than one litter in a season, and that could be either because she's lost, kind of like how some birds will have multiple clutches, like peregrines. So if they lay their eggs and they lose that first clutch, they will have a second clutch before the season is over to try and sustain their species. And I think bobcats are similar like that, but wildlife is not the same as domestic animals, and they don't reproduce the same. In fact, there was I don't know if it's one in my citations, but there is an older research book out there from the 50s that actually suggested that bobcats are incapable physically of having more than 3 kittens due to they were examining uteruses of female deceased bobcats, and kind of basically proved that they could not have more than 1 litter in a season too. I don't know how true that is. There's been no additional research on that I could find, so I don't know, but not like domestic cats at all. I think that is all the questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. If people would like to unmute, I know maybe there's 1 or 2 that didn't want to write something in the chat that might have a question. We'll give you that opportunity now. But so if you can unmute or on video and just wave at us. If Gary, if you have the control to unmute. Thank you in the meantime, Jennifer. A great presentation. I greatly appreciate your time and your knowledge and your passion.
Oh, there's a question.
Don S.
Yeah, thank you very much for your information tonight. It was really helpful.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I know I can talk a little fast, so hopefully there's so much information I could talk for another hour if you wanted me to.
We could sit here all night and listen to you too. It's pretty cool, and appreciate it. It's a little discouraging to hear about the IDNR and how it doesn't really necessarily matter, how many are there. They want to please the hunters, but
Yeah, it is. And I always tell this story too. Every year, full disclosure, and the reason I ended up in the media the first season so much is because I was one of those people that purchased a permit not to use, or at least entered the lottery to try and get a permit not to use. I've never gotten one in 5 seasons. It's very disappointing. But now I almost want one because I want to salvage for educational pelts. I won't purchase a pelt, but if I could have an educational pelt, I would love to be able to salvage one. But the other thing is every year I still do that. I also purchase a habitat stamp, a duck stamp. I still buy hunting licenses even though I don't use them because the DNR sees hunters as their constituents because they're funding them through these things. I don't have an opportunity to do that because I'm not a hunter. I'm not opposed to hunting by any means, but that's not for me. I'm not going to go out and become a deer hunter or anything. But I still want to be able to be a constituent of the IDNR, so they listen to my views too. It hasn't helped yet, but I still try and do it.
The reason I unmuted here is because I just recently did obtain a bobcat, and the IDNR actually contacted me and said a trapper accidentally trapped one, and would you want it? And I said sure. So I just got it taxidermied, and it's in the nature center now. But my thought was you might be able to contact IDNR, and next time they do have one, they might give it to you if you've got a scientific permit or something down that line.
Oh, that's great to know. Thank you for sharing that. What nature center are you with again?
It's a small nature center in Fulton, Illinois. It's in Whiteside County. We're on the Mississippi River.
Oh, nice. Thank you for joining.
Yep, you're welcome.
anybody else have any last minute questions?
I have a comment that might be kind of interesting. And that is that we moved here from California about 2.5 years ago. And I used to go for walks in California, and I lived in Burbank, right about, I don't know, half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from the open mountain areas of the Verdugo Mountains. So I'm walking along the streets in the residential neighborhood, and there's a bobcat crossing the street in front of me. And I'm looking at this going, no way. He's walking across from someone's yard into someone else's driveway. So I went to see if I could get his attention, and I did get his attention, and he stopped and he sat there for several seconds and just looked at me, and I stopped. I was about a yard away from him, maybe a little bit more than 1 yard's width, which in Glendale isn't very wide. And he just sat there and looked at me. And then when he was done and his curiosity was satisfied, he ran down the driveway and leaped up over the 5-foot tall cinder block wall into somebody's backyard, where I'm presuming he was trying to eat someone's pet.
So, well, that's a very interesting story. Thank you for sharing that. And typically, as I mentioned with the bobcat diet, what they eat, they typically don't eat domestic pets. I think it's a little bit of a myth too. Now, I'm not saying that they wouldn't, or that they haven't done it, but it's not typical for them to do that. In most cases, they really want to avoid humans and stay away from us, and really don't want anything to do with our pets. So they are opportunistic though. So certainly they might take advantage of a situation. I don't think in the state of Illinois too, there's no cases of any pets being killed. And interesting enough, in Kiowa Island, which is residential, right? And I've talked with the biologist there several times. He said they too do not have any issues with interactions with humans, and they've never lost a pet there to a bobcat.
Well, in California, we mostly lost pets to mountain lions.
Yes, yeah, mountain lions, definitely.
Yeah. However, I was kidding actually about the bobcat. Although there was a house about 3 houses down that has these little tiny yappy dogs that were about the right size for a snack.
So, and I don't know, if you guys haven't ever heard Peggy Doty present, she's great. She's with the University of Illinois Extension, and she does coyote presentations, and this always sticks out for me from her presentations. It's like coyotes really don't want to kill domestic pets either, but they want them, like the yappy dogs, they want them to be quiet. So when coyotes are out during breeding season or they're hunting and they hear a yapping dog and they attack it, it's because they want this yappy dog to be quiet. And I just think that's so interesting that
I
it's
don't
not,
blame you.
yeah, it's like, it's not really the coyote's fault. You should not let your dog out in the yard barking.
Hey, Jennifer, have there been any studies how many losses there are to like rodenticides where they're eating, poison mice that are, we're seeing that with, birds and especially raptors and things like that. Is there any kind of measurements on
I have
that?
not seen any. I know in California, they had issues with rodenticides in bobcats and in mountain lions. And I don't know, I haven't really followed up with what they're doing in Kiowa Island, but I'm sure they're monitoring that pretty closely. They've been trying to get the residents there to sign off on, a statement saying, yes, I'm not going to use rodenticide to support saving our bobcats. It's kind of an big initiative there right now. But I'm sure that they're studying the impacts right now or monitoring very closely the impact of rodenticides on their bobcat population.
And where is Kiowa Island again?
South Carolina.
South Carolina, okay.
They actually have, well, they used to have the most dense population of bobcat per square kilometer. So, one of the things the hunting organizations usually say is like, you have to control the predator population. But again, predators are really good at controlling themselves. One of the things I didn't mention too is like when you have predators in the population and you could see the deer population getting healthy. I heard a wolf researcher from the DNR in Wisconsin talk about where there's known wolf packs in Wisconsin, there's like almost 0 cases of CWD. So predators do such a great job of controlling disease and keeping populations in check that need to be. And predators don't overcompensate like prey species do either. So where deer will overcompensate in breeding and having more fawns, predators don't do that. So such different species.
Jennifer, one more question was added to the chat, maybe before we wrap up, about whether Joe Davies and Carroll counties or the Bobcats there, are they the native ones or were they introduced or reintroduced to that area?
Yeah, I keep hearing, different myths about that. I don't know that any bobcats were reintroduced to any areas. That's probably a better question for the IDNR. I keep hearing people say, well, they've reintroduced cougar to our areas in the state of Illinois too. And the DNR denies that. There are transient cougars that pass through our states, but we don't have a breeding population of cougars in Illinois. Some people adamantly disagree with that. I don't know. I can't say whether or not they were introduced or if they're the native cats in those areas, because I don't really know the answer to that.
Well, thank you very much. What a wonderful program. And I want to remind everybody that actually we videotaped this. I'm going to stop the recording right now, but we did have a